There is a verse in the Bible that speaks about wealth, but not the way the world understands wealth. It does not speak of money. It does not speak of gold. It does not speak of power. And even so, it is the most valuable verse someone can understand. Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in modern history, believed that true prosperity did not begin in the hands. It began in the mind and in the spirit. He built a steel empire, controlled industries, accumulated a fortune that, adjusted to today's standards, would be enormous. But at the end of his life, he said something that sounds contradictory. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. Why would someone who achieved so much say that? Because Carnegie understood something hidden in a biblical principle that almost no one truly practices. The verse is simple, short, but deep enough to change the destiny of anyone who understands it. It says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6 verse 21. Most people read this and move on, but Carnegie saw in it the most powerful law of prosperity. He understood that a man's treasure is not what he owns. It is what he values above everything. And here begins the point that almost no one accepts. If your treasure is only money, your heart becomes small. If your treasure is status, your peace depends on other people's opinions. If your treasure is comparison, your joy is never stable. But if your treasure is growth, construction, impact, purpose, then your heart becomes large enough to sustain real wealth. Carnegie realized something many rich people never understand. Money amplifies the heart. It does not transform it. If the heart is insecure, money creates fear of losing. If the heart is empty, money creates addictions. If the heart is selfish, money creates arrogance. But if the heart is aligned with something greater, money becomes a tool, not a master. Carnegie started poor, son of a weaver, immigrant, no privileges, but he carried an internal treasure, the conviction that his life had to mean something. He did not just want to earn, he wanted to build. While many wanted to rise in life to escape pain, he wanted to rise to create something bigger than himself. And that completely changes a person's mindset. Because when the treasure is only comfort, you stop early. When the treasure is only money, you burn out quickly. When the treasure is only approval, you live in fear. But when the treasure is purpose, you endure long processes. You withstand silence. You resist difficult seasons. And that is why this verse is so powerful. It does not speak about how much you have. It speaks about where your heart is anchored. Carnegie saw men become rich and lose everything. He saw brilliant businessmen self-destruct. He saw people achieve success and then live empty lives. And he noticed the pattern. They changed their bank account, but never changed their heart. They remained afraid. They kept comparing. They kept seeking validation. And money only amplified it. But Carnegie took the opposite path. He trained the mind before expanding the wealth. He built character before building empires. He strengthened the heart before strengthening business. And when wealth came, he already had the internal structure to sustain it. This biblical verse reveals an uncomfortable truth. You do not lose your peace because you lack money. You lose it because you place your heart in the wrong place. If your treasure is what others think, your peace depends on others. If your treasure is never failing, you live paralyzed. If your treasure is looking good, you move away from who you truly are. But when your treasure is becoming a better person inside, the external world stops controlling you. And Carnegie understood this so deeply that at the height of his wealth, he did something unthinkable. He began giving almost everything away. Libraries, universities, educational institutions, endowments for learning. He said that money that does not serve humanity becomes a burden. Why? Because he had already understood the verse. His treasure was not money. It was legacy. And that changes everything. Because when the treasure changes, decisions change. When the heart changes, priorities change. When priorities change, destiny changes. Most people ask, how do I get rich? But Carnegie would answer, First, discover what your treasure is, because that is what will control your heart. And your heart will control your life. And here is the deep point. The heart always governs decisions, and decisions always build destiny. You may have knowledge, but if your heart seeks only approval, you sabotage yourself. You may have talent, but if your heart is guided by fear, you stop halfway. You may have opportunities, but if your heart is attached to comfort, you never grow. But when the heart is aligned with something greater, you begin to act differently. You accept processes. You think long-term. You endure criticism. You keep going even when no one sees. And this creates real wealth. Not only financial, but mental, emotional, spiritual. And that is the foundation that sustains everything else. Most people read the verse, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," and think this is only spiritual. But Carnegie saw this as a practical law of life, because the heart is not only emotion, it is direction. What you value defines how you use your time, how you react to problems, how you deal with money, how you choose people, how you face failures. Your invisible treasure governs your visible choices. And here is the problem. Most people never consciously chose their treasure. It was shaped by the environment, by comparisons, by fear, by social pressure. So the heart clings to what the world taught it to value. Excessive security, approval, appearance, status, comfort. And this creates a silent internal conflict. The person wants to grow, but their heart wants comfort. The person wants to prosper, but their heart fears risk. The person wants to change their life, but their heart is tied to others' validation. Carnegie said this internal conflict is the reason many people do not move forward. They do not fail because of lack of ability. They fail because of internal misalignment. Because when the treasure is small, the heart cannot endure big processes. That is why many give up halfway, not for lack of talent, but because their heart is not anchored in the right place. Carnegie believed a man's greatest work is not external. It is internal. It is choosing what he will value above everything. Because what you value, you protect. What you protect, you feed. What you feed grows. If you value peace, you learn not to react to everything. If you value growth, you accept discomfort. If you value purpose, you endure silence and process. But if you value only ease, any difficulty becomes a reason to stop. That is why the verse is so powerful. It does not ask how much you have. It asks where your heart is. Carnegie saw men get rich and lose themselves. Money increased addictions. Power increased arrogance. Success increased loneliness, because their hearts were attached to fragile things. But he also saw simple people build something that lasted, not because they had more resources, but because they had a solid internal treasure. Carnegie believed that when the heart is aligned with greater values, the mind becomes stronger. And when the mind becomes stronger, decisions improve. And when decisions improve, results change. It is not spiritual in a mystical sense. It is spiritual in a structural sense. You cannot sustain external wealth without internal wealth. He said, many want to rise quickly, but do not want to grow on the inside. Then something dangerous happens. Life gives them a level their mind cannot sustain. Then come anxiety, fear of losing, self-sabotage, impulsive decisions, sudden collapse. And people say it was bad luck. But Carnegie would say, it was misalignment of the heart. This verse is a warning. If your treasure is in something fragile, your heart will be fragile. And a fragile heart cannot sustain great responsibility. That is why, even as a young man, Carnegie began asking himself, what is truly worth placing at the center of my life? And he chose growth, education, building, impact, legacy. So when money came, he did not lose it, because money was not the treasure. It was a tool. And here is the deepest part. The verse does not say, where your money is. It says, where your treasure is. Treasure is what you protect with your life. And today, if you observe your routine, your worries, your decisions, you will discover your real treasure. Not by what you say, but by what you prioritize. If your mind is constantly occupied with comparison, that is your treasure. If it is constantly occupied with fear, that is your treasure. If it is occupied with building and growth, that is your treasure. Carnegie believed life changes when you change this. It is not external force. It is internal reordering. You do not begin by changing circumstances. You begin by changing what sits at the center of your heart. Because when the treasure changes, your conversations change, your focus changes, your decisions change, your environment changes, your life changes, and the world begins to respond to a different mental pattern. He said prosperity does not begin when money arrives. It begins when the heart becomes organized, because a heart that is aligned does not lose control in success, does not panic in crisis, does not get lost in comparison, does not get distracted by what is not built. And this creates stability, and stability creates continuous growth. Carnegie understood that a man's greatest mistake is not lacking money. It is having a heart attached to what cannot sustain him. And that is why this verse is the richest, because it reveals that true wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in what governs your heart. And when the heart is governed by purpose, growth, and solid values, external life begins to align naturally, not by miracle, but by coherence. And Carnegie would leave this final reflection. You do not need to chase wealth. You need to reorganize your internal treasure. Because when the heart changes level, life is forced to follow. Andrew Carnegie believed that most people spend their entire lives trying to change the outside, without realizing that the verse has already revealed the secret. Your heart follows your treasure. And the problem is not that people don't want to improve their lives. It's that their treasure is still in the wrong place. They want peace, but their treasure is in comparison. They want prosperity, but their treasure is in other people's approval. They want growth, but their treasure is in comfort. And the heart, obedient, follows that. Carnegie said the heart is loyal. It does not argue with you. It simply attaches itself to what you value most. If you value security above everything, your heart will run from risk. If you value image, your heart will fear judgment. If you value ease, your heart will avoid difficult processes. And then the person says, I don't know why I'm not moving forward. But Carnegie saw it clearly. It's not lack of opportunity. It's lack of internal alignment. He understood that when the treasure changes, the heart changes direction. And when the heart changes direction, behavior changes. And when behavior changes consistently, destiny changes. But this does not happen through temporary enthusiasm. It happens through a silent decision. Carnegie did not wake up one day motivated. He decided, while still young, that his treasure would not be what others thought. Fear of making mistakes, immediate comfort, quick recognition. He placed his treasure in growth, learning, building, legacy, and that reorganized everything. He endured hard work because his treasure was greater than discomfort. He endured silence because his treasure was greater than the need to be seen. He endured process because his treasure was greater than urgency. That is why few understood the verse. Because it is not about religion. It is about priority. It asks, what governs you on the inside? Because what governs you builds your life. Carnegie saw brilliant men lose themselves because their treasure was fragile. They lived to impress, to compete, to appear superior. But when money came, they could not sustain it. Because wealth amplifies what is already inside. If the treasure is ego, ego grows. If the treasure is fear, fear grows. If the treasure is purpose, purpose grows. And here is the decisive point. You don't need to change your whole life today. You only need to move your treasure to a new place. Replace approval building, comfort growth, comparison purpose. Urgency, consistency. When this happens, the heart begins to obey a new direction. And without realizing it, your choices change. You begin to say no more firmly. Use your time more consciously. React less. Plan more. Speak less. Build more. And life begins to leave survival mode and enter construction mode. Carnegie said the world does not respond to what you desire. It responds to the pattern that governs your heart. If the pattern is fear, you see threats. If it is scarcity, you see lack. If it is purpose, you see possibility. The world didn't change. You changed the lens. And when the lens changes, reality changes. This is the true meaning of the verse. It does not promise automatic wealth. It reveals the invisible root of wealth. It is not money that changes a man. It is what governs a man's heart that changes everything. Carnegie did not build only a steel empire. He built an inner empire, and that empire sustained the outer one. So he could end with something simple. You don't need to seek more. You need to choose better what occupies the center of your heart. Because where your treasure is, your mind will be. Your time will be. Your decisions will be. Your energy will be. And inevitably, your destiny will be there as well. And when the heart aligns with something greater, life as a whole begins to move in that direction. Without announcements, without noise, but with results no one can ignore.